He's not yours. The words came out too fast, too sharp, like something rehearsed 100 times but never meant to be heard out loud, and for a moment, even she didn't recognize her own voice. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the polished marble floor of the downtown lobby, the kind of place where everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and quiet money, where heels echoed too loudly and people avoided eye contact unless it was strategic. Emily Carter tightened her grip on the small hand beside her, her fingers trembling just enough for the little boy to notice, because Noah looked up at her with those wide, searching eyes that always seemed to understand more than he should. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice soft, uncertain, as if he could feel the shift in the air before anyone else could. Emily forced a smile she didn't feel, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear with her free hand, her heart pounding so hard it made her chest ache. "It's nothing, baby," she murmured, though nothing had never felt this heavy before. Across from them, Daniel Hayes didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, tall and still in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Emily's rent for 6 months, his gaze locked not on her, but on the child. The boy. The silence stretched between them, thick and electric, broken only by the distant hum of elevators and the faint murmur of conversations that suddenly felt miles away. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his sharp blue eyes tracing every detail of Noah's face as if committing it to memory, as if searching for something he hadn't expected to find. And then, finally, he spoke. "Then explain him." His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something dangerous, not in anger, but in certainty. Emily's breath caught. For a second, the world tilted, the polished floor beneath her feet no longer steady. She had prepared for this moment in 100 different ways. She had imagined running into him in crowded streets, in grocery stores, in places where she could disappear. But not here. Not like this. Not with Noah standing right between them, looking from one face to the other like he was trying to solve a puzzle no child should have to understand. "We should go," Emily said quickly, her voice lower now, tighter, as she pulled Noah gently toward the exit. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against the marble, a quiet contrast to the confident stride she forced herself to maintain. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Because if she did, she knew she would see it, that look in his eyes. The one that said he wasn't going to let this go. Outside, the air hit her like a wave, cool and sharp, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and city life that felt strangely disconnected from the storm building inside her chest. She knelt down in front of Noah, smoothing his jacket, buying herself a few seconds to breathe. "Hey," she said softly, brushing her thumb across his cheek. "You did nothing wrong, okay?" Noah nodded slowly, but his eyes flickered past her shoulder, curiosity pulling him towards something he couldn't name. Emily followed his gaze before she could stop herself. Daniel was standing just inside the glass doors, still watching them. Not approaching. Not calling out. Just watching. Like a man who had just found something he didn't know he'd lost. Emily's stomach twisted. Because she recognized that look. Not from today. Not from this moment. But from years ago. Before everything had fallen apart, before silence had replaced promises, before she had learned how to survive without asking for anything from anyone. She stood quickly, taking Noah's hand again, this time more firmly. "Come on," she said, her voice steady now, practiced. "We're going home." And as they walked away, blending into the crowded sidewalk, Emily didn't notice the way Noah glanced back one last time. But Daniel did. And in that single glance, in the shape of a small face framed by soft brown hair and eyes that mirrored his own more than coincidence ever should, something inside him shifted, quietly, but permanently. He didn't chase them. He didn't call out. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and without breaking his gaze said one simple sentence. "I want everything you can find on Emily Carter." Because some truths didn't need to be proven. They only needed to be uncovered. The city lights blurred past the bus window in streaks of gold and white, each one flickering like a memory Emily Carter refused to revisit, and yet could not fully escape. She sat near the back, Noah curled beside her with his small head resting against her arm, his breathing slow and even, the soft rhythm of a child who trusted the world more than it deserved. Emily stared straight ahead, her reflection faint in the glass, pale and tired under the harsh fluorescent lights above, and for the first time in years, she felt something she had trained herself to ignore begin to surface again. Fear, not the loud kind, not the kind that made you run, but the quiet kind that settled deep in your chest and whispered that something inevitable had already begun. She tightened her hold on Noah as the bus turned sharply, the tires hissing against wet pavement, and closed her eyes for a second longer than she should have. She had done everything right. She had stayed invisible. She had chosen small apartments in neighborhoods no one paid attention to, worked jobs that did not ask questions, kept her head down, and her past buried so deep it felt like another lifetime. And still, somehow, it had found her. Across the city, in an office that stretched wall to wall with glass and skyline, Daniel Hayes stood alone, his jacket draped over the back of a leather chair he had not sat in for over an hour. The file on his desk was thin. Too thin. A single mother, age 28, part-time work history, frequent address changes, no outstanding debts, no criminal record, nothing that explained the look he had seen in that child's eyes. Daniel flipped the page again, slower this time, as if the answers might appear if he simply gave them enough space. Emily Carter. The name meant nothing to anyone else. But it refused to feel like nothing to him. His assistant's voice broke the silence through the intercom, hesitant, careful. "Sir, we found a hospital record." Daniel did not respond right away. He walked to the window instead, looking down at the city he controlled in ways most people never understood, the traffic. Moving in precise patterns, the buildings rising like decisions made years ago and never questioned. "Read it," he said finally, his voice quiet. 3 years ago," she began. "St. Mary's Medical Center. A birth record under the name Emily Carter. Male child. No father listed." The words settled into the room like a weight that did not belong to anyone else. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in disbelief, but in recognition. Because suddenly, the timeline aligned too easily. Too precisely. "Anything else?" he asked. "Yes, sir. There is a note attached to the file. It says the patient declined to provide additional information and requested no contact." Daniel let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the desk. She had not just disappeared. She had chosen to remain hidden. That was different. That meant something. Back on the bus, Emily shifted slightly as Noah stirred, his small hand reaching instinctively for hers even in his sleep. She squeezed it gently, grounding herself in the only truth that mattered now. She had built this life piece by piece, fragile but real, and she would not let anyone take it from her. Not even him. Especially not him. The bus slowed to a stop with a soft mechanical sigh, and Emily stood carefully, guiding Noah as he blinked awake, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Are we home?" he asked softly, rubbing his face. Emily forced a small smile, brushing his hair back the way she always did. "Almost," she said. "Just a few more steps." Outside, the air felt colder than before, the kind that settled into your bones if you stood still too long. Emily pulled Noah's jacket tighter and started down the quiet street, each step deliberate, measured, like she could outrun something if she kept moving. What she did not know was that across the city, Daniel Hayes had already stopped searching for answers. Because in his world, once a question became personal, it did not stay unanswered for long. And for the first time in years, something had become personal. The hallway outside Emily Carter's apartment smelled faintly of old paint and something like burnt coffee, the kind of scent that clung to buildings that had seen too many lives pass through without ever really changing, and as she fumbled quietly with her keys, Noah leaned against her side, still half asleep, his small weight a reminder of everything she had fought to protect. The door creaked softly as it opened, revealing the narrow space inside, dim but warm, filled with the quiet evidence of a life built carefully, deliberately, with no room for mistakes. Emily stepped in first, flipping the light switch with her elbow, then guiding Noah toward the couch where a small blanket was already waiting. "Shoes off, buddy," she whispered, her voice softer now, gentler, as if the walls themselves required a different version of her. Noah obeyed without question, his movements slow, trusting, and within seconds he curled up, pulling the blanket over himself with a small sigh that carried the kind of peace Emily rarely allowed herself to feel. She stood there for a moment, watching him, her chest tightening not from fear this time, but from something quieter, something that reminded her why she had made every choice she had made, even the ones that still haunted her. Across town, the city had not slowed. It never did. But inside Daniel Hayes's office, time had shifted into something sharper, more focused, like a lens narrowing on a single point. He stood at his desk again, the hospital record now joined by a second file, thicker, more detailed, each page a piece of a life that had been intentionally hidden. Employment records from small accounting firms, short contracts, gaps that spoke louder than any explanation, and then the address history, each one a step away from something, or someone. Daniel traced the pattern without needing to say it out loud. She had not been running randomly. She had been moving with purpose. "Sir?" His assistant's voice came again, quieter this time, almost cautious. "There is something else." Daniel did not look up. "Go on." "We found a connection. 3 years ago, before the birth, Emily Carter was briefly registered under a different name. Emily Dawson." Daniel's hand paused. Just slightly. But enough. Because that name was not unfamiliar. It did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to a night he had not thought about in years, a night that had been filed away under decisions that did not matter anymore, under moments that were never supposed to follow him into the future. And yet here it was. Not as a memory, but as something real. Something living. Back in the apartment, Emily moved quietly through the small kitchen, filling a glass of water she did not really need, her mind replaying the moment from earlier over and over again, each detail sharper than the last. The way he had looked at Noah. Not confused. Not surprised. But certain. That was what unsettled her the most. Because certainty meant he would not stop. She set the glass down untouched, her fingers pressing against the counter as she leaned forward slightly, trying to steady the wave of thoughts she could not control. She had always known this day might come. She had prepared for questions, for coincidences, even for recognition. But she had not prepared for him to see the truth without needing it explained. A soft sound pulled her back. Noah shifting on the couch, his eyes opening slowly, searching the room until they found her. "Mom?" he said, his voice small but steady. Emily crossed the room in 2 steps, kneeling beside him, her hand brushing gently against his cheek. "I am right here," she said. He studied her face for a second longer than usual, his expression thoughtful in a way that felt too old for his age. "That man," he said quietly. "He looked at me like he knew me." Emily's breath caught, just for a second, before she forced a calm she did not feel. "Sometimes people think they know things they do not," she replied softly. Noah nodded, but his eyes did not fully agree. Across the city, Daniel Hayes finally sat down, the file still open in front of him, but his attention no longer on the pages. Because now, it was no longer about records or timelines or missing information. It was about a moment he could not ignore, a connection that did not need proof to feel real. He leaned back slightly, his gaze distant, but focused in a way that meant a decision had already been made. "Prepare the car," he said quietly. Because some distances were not meant to stay between people. And some truths did not wait to be discovered. They moved toward you, whether you were ready or not. The engine of the black car purred softly as it rolled through streets that grew quieter with every block, trading glass towers for worn brick buildings and neon reflections for dim porch lights. And Daniel Hayes sat in the back seat with his gaze fixed forward, not on the road, but on something much further ahead, something he had not planned for and could no longer ignore. The driver did not speak. He had learned long ago that silence was part of the job, especially on nights like this, when the destination mattered less than the reason behind it. Daniel's phone rested loosely in his hand, the screen dark now, the files already memorized, every detail of Emily Carter's life laid out in neat, clinical lines that failed to explain the one thing that mattered most. He did not need more data. He needed answers. Real ones. The car slowed as it turned onto a narrower street, the tires crunching lightly over uneven pavement, and Daniel finally looked outside, taking in the row of aging apartment buildings, each one nearly identical, each one holding stories no one else would ever read. "This is it, sir," the driver said quietly. Daniel nodded once, already reaching for the door before the car had fully stopped, stepping out into the cool night air that carried the distant hum of the city but felt different here, closer, more personal. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, though it no longer mattered how he looked, and walked toward the entrance without hesitation, his steps measured, deliberate, like a man who had already decided he would not turn back. Inside, the hallway lights flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows along the narrow walls, and somewhere above, a television played too loudly, the muffled dialogue blending into the quiet rhythm of footsteps and distant movement. Daniel moved past it all, his focus narrowing as he reached the second floor, the numbers on each door guiding him until he stopped in front of one that looked no different from the others, except for the small, worn welcome mat that sat slightly off-center, as if it had been adjusted one too many times. For a moment, he did nothing. No knock. No announcement. Just a stillness that felt heavier than action. Then, finally, he raised his hand and knocked once. Inside, Emily froze. The sound was soft, controlled, but it cut through the apartment like a signal she had been waiting for without ever wanting it to come. Noah was already asleep again, curled up under his blanket, his steady breathing filling the room with a fragile sense of calm that now felt like it could break at any second. Emily stood slowly, her heart pounding in a rhythm that made everything else fade, and for a brief second, she considered not answering. She could pretend she was not home. She could wait it out. But something deep inside her knew that would not change anything. He was not the kind of man who left questions unanswered. She walked to the door, each step quieter than the last, her hand hovering over the handle before she finally turned it, opening it just enough to see him standing there, exactly as she remembered and yet completely different. "You found me," she said softly, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. Daniel's expression did not change, but his eyes did, shifting slightly as they took her in, searching for something beneath the surface. "You made it difficult," he replied, his tone calm, almost neutral, as if they were discussing something ordinary instead of the weight that stood between them. Emily let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding and opened the door a little wider, not as an invitation, but as an acknowledgement that this moment could not be avoided. "You should not be here," she said quietly. Daniel glanced past her for just a second, enough to catch a glimpse of the small apartment, the couch, the blanket, the outline of a child sleeping peacefully, and when his gaze returned to her, there was no hesitation left. "I think I should," he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything neither of them had said, everything that had been left behind years ago, and had now found its way back without permission. Emily stepped aside slowly, her movements controlled, measured, and Daniel walked in, not like a stranger, but not like someone who belonged either, his presence filling the small space in a way that changed it instantly. He stopped a few feet from the couch, his eyes drawn to Noah, the rise and fall of his chest, the soft curl of his hand against the blanket, and for a moment, the world narrowed again, just like it had in the lobby. Emily watched him carefully, every muscle in her body tense, waiting for something, anything, that would tell her how this was going to unfold. Daniel did not speak right away. He did not need to. Because standing there, looking at the child, he already knew this was no longer a question he could walk away from. And for the first time since he had knocked on that door, his voice was not just calm. It was certain. "We need to talk," he said quietly. The air inside the apartment shifted the moment the door closed behind him, sealing the quiet space with a tension that did not belong to its worn furniture or soft lighting, and Emily Carter felt it settle into her chest as she stood a few feet away, her arms folded tightly as if holding herself together required effort she could not afford to lose. Daniel Hayes remained near the couch, his gaze still fixed on Noah, who had not stirred, his small form rising and falling in steady rhythm, untouched by the weight of the moment unfolding just feet away. For a long second either of them spoke, the silence stretching until it felt like something fragile might break under it. Then Emily moved first, stepping forward just enough to place herself slightly between Daniel and the couch, not blocking his view, but reminding him of a boundary that still existed. "You should keep your voice down," she said quietly, her tone controlled but firm. "He is asleep." Daniel nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, before finally shifting his attention from the child to her, and when he did, there was no confusion left in his expression, only focus. "How long were you planning to keep this from me?" he asked, his voice low, measured, but carrying a weight that pressed against the room. Emily exhaled slowly, her eyes flickering toward Noah for just a second before returning to Daniel. "There is nothing to keep," she replied, the words coming out smoother than she felt. "You saw him. That does not mean anything." Daniel did not react immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, not aggressive, not forceful, but deliberate, closing the distance just enough that the conversation could no longer pretend to be distant. "It means something," he said quietly. "You know it does." Emily shook her head, but the movement lacked conviction, her fingers tightening against her arms as if she could anchor herself to the version of the truth she had lived with for years. "You are making assumptions," she said. "People do that all the time. They see what they want to see." Daniel studied her for a moment, not her words, but the space between them, the hesitation she could not fully hide, the way her voice held steady but her posture did not. "Then help me understand," he said, his tone unchanged, but softer now, not less certain, just more precise. "Because I do not make assumptions without a reason." The room seemed to hold its breath. Emily looked away first, her gaze drifting toward the small kitchen, the chipped counter, the glass of water she had not touched, every detail grounding her in the life she had built without him. "3 years ago," she began, her voice quieter now, not weaker, just more honest than she intended. "You had a life that did not include me." Daniel did not interrupt. He let the words sit, waiting, knowing there was more behind them. Emily swallowed, the memory surfacing whether she wanted it to or not. "That night," she continued slowly, "it was not supposed to matter. It was one of those moments people forget. You forget." Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not in denial, but in recognition, the pieces aligning in a way that felt too exact to dismiss. "I did not forget," he said quietly. Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "Maybe not," she said. "But you did not come looking either." The words landed softly, but they carried years of distance within them. Daniel's jaw tightened just enough to show he felt it, but he did not step back, did not retreat into the version of himself that solved problems with distance and control. "You disappeared," he replied. "There was nothing to find." Emily looked at him then, really looked, and for a second, the space between past and present blurred in a way that made everything harder to hold together. "I did not disappear," she said. "I stepped out of something that was never mine to begin with." The silence returned, heavier now, filled with truths neither of them had fully said yet. Daniel's gaze shifted once more to Noah, and this time, it lingered longer, not searching, not questioning, but absorbing, as if the answer was already there and he was simply allowing himself to accept it. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but stronger in a way that did not need volume. "You had a child," he said. "And you chose to do it alone." Emily's shoulders tensed, the weight of that choice pressing back against her, but she did not look away. "I did what I had to do," she replied. Daniel nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding that the conversation had reached a point where denial no longer held the same shape. "And now?" he asked, his eyes returning to hers steady, unwavering. Emily hesitated, just for a second, before answering. Now nothing changes. But even as she said it, the certainty she had built over the years felt thinner than it had ever been, like something that had been strong enough to survive distance, but not strong enough to survive the truth standing right in front of her. The word lingered in the air long after Emily said it, thin and fragile, like something that had been true for years but no longer held the same weight under the light of this moment, and Daniel Hayes did not respond right away, because he was not listening to the words anymore. He was listening to everything behind them, the hesitation, the quiet fracture and certainty that she could not fully hide. He shifted his gaze once more to Noah, who stirred slightly on the couch, his small hand adjusting the edge of the blanket before settling again, unaware that his entire world was being quietly redefined just a few feet away. Daniel took a slow breath, then stepped back, creating space not to retreat, but to think, to measure the moment without breaking it. "You believe that?" he said finally, his voice calm, almost reflective. "That nothing changes?" Emily held her ground, though her posture had softened just enough to betray the effort it took to maintain it. "It has not changed for 3 years," she replied. "It does not need to now." Daniel nodded once, as if acknowledging the logic, but not accepting the conclusion. 3 years is not proof," he said quietly. "It is distance." Emily's eyes flickered, just for a second, and that was all he needed to see. "Distance can protect things," she said, her voice lower now, more personal. "It can keep them intact." Daniel studied her carefully, then asked the question that had been building beneath everything else. "From what?" The room seemed to tighten again, the simple question carrying more weight than anything that had come before it. Emily looked away, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the faint glow of streetlights pressed against the glass, distant and unreachable. "From you," she said softly. The honesty in it did not come with anger or blame, just a quiet recognition of something she had lived with for too long. Daniel did not react the way she expected. He did not argue, did not defend himself, did not shift the focus back onto her choices. Instead, he absorbed it, the same way he had absorbed everything else, with a kind of stillness that made it impossible to predict what would come next. "You think I would have made this harder for you?" he said. It was not a question. Emily let out a small breath, her shoulders lowering slightly as if the truth had already taken something out of her. "I think your world is not built for people like me," she replied. "And I was not going to raise him inside something that could take him away from me the moment it became inconvenient." Daniel's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough that the shift could be felt. "You think I would take him away?" he said quietly. Emily did not answer right away. She looked at Noah again, her eyes softening in a way that made everything else seem secondary. "I think you could," she said. "And that is enough." The words settled between them, not as an accusation, but as a boundary she had built her entire life around. Daniel stepped closer again, but this time slower, more deliberate, as if he understood that pushing too hard would break something he did not yet fully understand. "Emily," he said, her name steady in his voice, "you made a decision without me." She met his gaze again, her own steadier now, as if she had reached a part of the conversation where fear no longer controlled her. "I made a decision for him," she corrected. Daniel held her eyes for a long moment, then nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that her reasoning, however flawed he might see it, was real. "And now I am here," he said. "So we do not get to pretend this is still only your decision." Emily's breath caught, not because she had not expected this, but because hearing it out loud made it real in a way she could no longer contain. "You do not get to walk into our lives and change everything overnight," she said, her voice stronger now, anchored by something deeper than fear. Daniel's response came without hesitation, but without force. "I am not here to change everything," he said. "I am here because something already has." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different, less about resistance, more about recognition. Emily felt it too, the shift that had begun the moment he knocked on the door, the quiet understanding that the life she had protected so carefully was no longer untouched. Daniel glanced at Noah once more, then back at her, his voice softer now, but more certain than ever. You said nothing changes? He continued. But that is not true. Emily did not speak. She did not need to. Because somewhere deep inside she already knew he was right. And that was the part she had never prepared for. The quiet in the room did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like something adjusting to a new weight, and Emily Carter felt it in the way her breathing changed, in the way her hands no longer held the same steady tension they had just moments before. Daniel Hayes did not move closer this time, did not press forward with more questions or demands, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. Because she had prepared herself to resist force, to defend against pressure, but not this kind of stillness, this kind of patience that did not need to prove itself. Noah shifted again on the couch, his small body turning slightly as if responding to something deeper than sound, and then, unexpectedly, his eyes opened. Slow at first, unfocused, then clearer as he looked around the room, taking in the shapes and shadows before landing on the figure that did not belong to his usual world. Daniel. For a second, either adult spoke. They both watched, caught in a moment that did not ask permission before unfolding. Noah pushed himself up slightly, the blanket slipping from his shoulders, his gaze fixed on Daniel with a quiet curiosity that felt almost familiar. "You are still here," he said softly, his voice carrying no fear, only observation. Daniel's expression shifted, not into a smile, but into something gentler, something less guarded than before. "I am," he replied, his tone matching the calm of the child in front of him. Emily stepped forward instinctively, her hand brushing lightly against Noah's shoulder, grounding him, grounding herself. "It is late," she said quietly. "You should go back to sleep." But Noah did not look at her. His eyes remained on Daniel, studying him in a way that felt too intentional to be accidental. "You look like me," he said, the words simple, unfiltered, but landing with a weight that filled the entire room. Emily's breath caught sharply, her fingers tightening slightly against Noah's shoulder, while Daniel stood completely still, the truth spoken aloud in a way neither of them had been willing to say. "Noah," Emily said softly, her voice steady but urgent. "That is enough." But Noah frowned slightly, not in defiance, but in confusion, as if he could not understand why something so obvious needed to be dismissed. "It is true," he added quietly, his gaze moving between them now, searching for confirmation he did not yet know how to ask for. Daniel took a slow step forward, not toward Emily this time, but toward Noah, stopping at a distance that respected the space, but acknowledged the connection. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Noah," the boy replied without hesitation. Daniel nodded once, the name settling into something deeper than memory. "That is a good name," he said. Noah studied him for another second, then asked, "What is yours?" There was a brief pause, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what that answer now carried. "Daniel," he said. Noah repeated it quietly, as if testing how it felt. "Daniel." Emily watched the exchange with attention that had shifted from defensive to something more complicated, something she could not easily control. This was the part she had feared, not confrontation, not questions, but connection. Because connection did not ask for permission. It simply happened. "Okay," Noah said finally, his voice softer now, as if satisfied with something he could not fully explain, and then he leaned back against the couch, pulling the blanket up again with a small yawn that reminded everyone in the room that he was still just a child. Within moments, his eyes closed once more, his breathing returning to that steady rhythm that had been interrupted only briefly. The silence returned, but it was no longer the same. Emily stepped back slowly, her hand falling to her side, her eyes fixed on Daniel in a way that held both warning and something dangerously close to vulnerability. "You should leave," she said quietly, but the words did not carry the same finality as before. Daniel did not respond immediately. His gaze lingered on Noah for one last second before lifting to meet hers again, and this time, there was no distance left in it. "He did not need an explanation," Daniel said softly. Emily swallowed, her composure thinning just enough to reveal what she had been holding back. He is a child, she replied. Children say things? Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth without accepting it as complete. Children do not pretend, he said. The words settled into the space between them, simple, undeniable. Emily looked away first, her eyes drawn once more to Noah, to the life she had built, the truths she had protected, and the reality she could no longer fully control. Daniel stepped back then, not leaving yet, but creating space again, as if understanding that this moment had already changed more than either of them could undo. This is not over, he said quietly, not as a threat, but as a certainty. Emily did not argue. Because for the first time, she knew that some things, once seen, could never be unseen. And some truths, once spoken, could never be taken back. The door closed softly behind Daniel Hayes, the quiet click echoing longer than it should have in the small apartment, and for a moment, Emily Carter just stood there, her hand still resting against the edge of the door as if she could hold the moment in place and stop everything that had already begun to change. The room felt different now, not because anything had moved, but because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be put back where it belonged. She turned slowly, her eyes drifting back to the couch where Noah slept, his small frame curled under the blanket, untouched by the storm that had passed so close to him without fully waking him. Emily walked toward him quietly, kneeling beside the couch as she brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her fingers lingering there a second longer than usual. "I am sorry," she whispered, though she was not sure if she was apologizing for what had happened, or for what was coming next. Outside, the night air felt colder as Daniel stepped onto the sidewalk, the door to the building closing behind him with a dull thud that seemed to separate two worlds he could no longer pretend were disconnected. He did not rush to the car. He did not reach for his phone. Instead, he stood there for a moment, looking up at the second-floor window where a faint light still glowed, steady and warm against the dark. 3 years. The number repeated in his mind, not as a measure of time, but as a measure of absence. Of everything he had not known, everything he had not seen. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something quieter, something that felt unfamiliar in its weight. Regret, not for a decision made, but for a reality he had not been given the chance to choose. The driver opened the car door without a word, but Daniel did not move. Right away. His gaze remained fixed on that window, as if he could see through it, as if he could understand everything that had happened inside without needing to ask. But he could not. And that was the problem. Back upstairs, Emily sat on the edge of the couch now, her posture no longer rigid, but heavy, as if holding herself together had finally become too much. She replayed every word, every look, every moment that had passed between them, searching for something she could have done differently, something that might have kept this from happening. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was not something she could have avoided forever. She had only delayed it. Noah shifted again, his small hand reaching instinctively until it found hers, even in sleep, and Emily tightened her grip gently, grounding herself in the one thing that had always been certain. "It is just us," she murmured softly, though the words felt less absolute than they had just hours ago. Across the street, Daniel finally stepped into the car, the door closing quietly behind him as the city resumed its distant rhythm around them. He leaned back slightly, his gaze forward now, but unfocused, his mind still inside that apartment, still on that couch, still on the child who had said his name without fear, without hesitation. "Sir?" the driver asked carefully, waiting for direction. Daniel did not answer immediately. He reached into his jacket instead, pulling out his phone, the screen lighting up in the dim interior, as he scrolled briefly before stopping on a single contact. His thumb hovered for a second, then pressed call. The line connected almost instantly. "I need a full legal review," Daniel said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "Custody laws. Parental rights. Everything." There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable, before the response came. "Of course, sir." Daniel ended the call without another word, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpened into something that could not be undone. Back upstairs, Emily exhaled slowly, her eyes closing for just a second as exhaustion finally began to settle into her bones. But sleep did not come. It would not. Not tonight. Because somewhere deep inside she could feel it, the shift that had already taken place, the quiet understanding that the life she had protected was no longer entirely hers to control. And as she opened her eyes again, looking down at Noah, she realized something that made her chest tighten in a way she could not ignore. This was no longer just about keeping him safe from the world. It was about deciding what part of the truth he deserved to know. And for the first time in 3 years, Emily Carter did not have an answer. Morning did not arrive gently, it slipped into the apartment through thin curtains and narrow lines of pale light, catching on dust in the air and settling quietly across the small living room where Emily Carter had not moved from the couch, her body still angled protectively toward Noah, who now slept deeper, untouched by the long night that had stretched far beyond its usual hours. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but they remained open, fixed on nothing in particular, replaying every moment again and again until the details blurred into something heavier than memory. The soft hum of a passing car outside broke the silence for a second before fading again, leaving behind a stillness that felt unfamiliar, like the world had shifted slightly out of alignment. Noah stirred first, his small hand tightening briefly around hers before he blinked awake, his eyes adjusting to the morning light as he looked up at her. "Did I fall asleep on the couch again?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep, unaware of how much had changed while he rested. Emily forced a small smile, brushing her fingers gently through his hair. "You did," she said softly. "It happens." Noah pushed himself up slowly, glancing around the room before his expression shifted, a faint memory returning. "That man," he said quietly, his voice more alert now. "Daniel." Emily's chest tightened at the name spoken so easily, so naturally, as if it already belonged in their lives. "He came here," Noah continued, watching her carefully, not as a child seeking permission, but as someone trying to understand. Emily hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. "He did," she admitted. Noah frowned slightly, his small brows pulling together in thought. "He did not seem like a stranger," he said. The simplicity of the statement made it harder to answer. Emily looked down at their joined hands, her thumb moving slowly across his knuckles as she searched for something that would not break the fragile balance she had held for so long. "Sometimes people are connected in ways we do not always understand right away," she said gently. Noah considered that, his gaze drifting toward the window where sunlight now touched the edge of the floor. "Is he coming back?" he asked. The question landed softly, but it carried a weight Emily could not ignore. She inhaled slowly, her mind racing ahead to possibilities she had not yet fully faced. "I do not know," she answered honestly, because anything else would have been a lie. Across the city, Daniel Hayes stood in front of the wide windows of his office once again, the morning skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. But his focus remained somewhere else entirely. The documents on his desk had grown overnight, legal briefs, case references, timelines, all arranged with precision, yet none of them gave him what he needed most. Certainty did not come from paper. It came from something else. His phone buzzed lightly against the surface of the desk, a message from his legal advisor confirming preliminary findings, outlining pathways, options, strategies. Words that turned something deeply personal into a structured process. Daniel read them once, then set the phone aside without responding. Because this was not a negotiation. Not yet. Back in the apartment, Emily stood at the small kitchen counter, pouring cereal into a bowl with movements that felt automatic, practiced, the kind that filled space when the mind could not rest. Noah sat at the table, swinging his legs slightly, watching her in that quiet way that had begun to feel too perceptive for his age. "Mom," he said after a moment, his voice softer now. "Did I do something wrong yesterday?" The question caught her off guard, pulling her fully back into the present. She turned quickly, crossing the space between them in 2 steps, kneeling in front of him so their eyes met at the same level. "No," she said firmly, her voice steady with something stronger than uncertainty. You did nothing wrong. Noah studied her face for a second, then nodded, accepting the answer, even if he did not fully understand it. Emily exhaled slowly, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders, grounding both of them in the moment that still belonged only to them. But as she stood again, her gaze drifting toward the door, she felt it, the quiet shift that had not left with the night. Because somewhere beyond that door, beyond the small world she had built, there was someone who now knew the truth. And the kind of truth that Daniel Hayes carried did not stay unanswered for long. The morning moved forward whether Emily Carter was ready for it or not, the clock on the wall ticking with quiet insistence as if time itself refused to pause for uncertainty, and she found herself moving through routine with a precision that came not from calm, but from necessity. Noah sat at the small table, finishing his cereal with careful focus, his earlier questions settling into a quiet curiosity that had not disappeared, only shifted into something he was still trying to understand. Emily watched him for a moment longer than usual, committing the small details to memory, the way he held his spoon, the way his eyes softened when he looked up at her, the familiar rhythm of a life that had always been theirs alone. "Do you have everything for school?" she asked gently, her voice steady, anchored in the routine that had always kept everything else from falling apart. Noah nodded, sliding off the chair and reaching for his backpack by the door. "Yes," he said, then hesitated, his hand resting on the strap as he glanced back at her. "If Daniel comes back, will you tell me?" The question came without fear, without hesitation, and Emily felt it land deeper than anything else he had said. She stepped closer, crouching slightly so she was at his level again, her expression soft but serious. "If anything changes, I will tell you," she said, choosing each word carefully, not because she wanted to avoid the truth, but because she no longer knew what shape that truth would take. Noah studied her face for a second, then nodded, accepting the answer in the way children often do, trusting not the words themselves, but the person saying them. "Okay," he said quietly. Minutes later, the door closed behind him, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Emily alone in a silence that felt louder than before. She stood there for a long moment, her hand still resting on the door, the same way it had the night before, as if she could feel the difference between what had been and what was coming. Across the city, Daniel Hayes stepped out of his office building, the morning air crisp against his skin as the city moved around him in its usual rhythm, unaware that something significant had shifted just beneath the surface. His car waited at the curb, but he did not get in right away. Instead, he glanced down at the folder in his hand, thinner now, not because it lacked information, but because the facts no longer needed to be expanded. He had what he needed. Not proof in the legal sense, not yet, but something more immediate, more undeniable. He closed the folder slowly, then handed it back to his assistant without looking at it again. "Hold off on the legal process," he said calmly. The assistant blinked, caught off guard. "Sir?" Daniel's gaze lifted, steady and clear. "This is not how I want to do this," he clarified. The assistant nodded quickly, adjusting without question. "Of course." Daniel stepped into the car then, the door closing behind him with quiet finality, but his expression remained thoughtful, not resolved. Because this was no longer about what he could claim. It was about what he chose to build. Back at the apartment, Emily moved slowly through the space, picking up small items, straightening things that did not need to be straightened, her mind running ahead of her actions. She knew he would not stop. She had seen it in his eyes, in the way he stood, in the way he listened. But something else had unsettled her more than his determination. He had not threatened. He had not demanded. He had simply stayed. That was harder to fight. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. Lighter than the one from the night before, almost casual, but it still made her heart skip in a way she could not control. She froze for a second, her breath catching before she forced herself to move, crossing the room with steps that felt slower than they were. When she opened the door, she was not surprised to see him there again. But she was not prepared for what he held in his hand. A small paper bag, simple, unmarked, nothing like the world he came from. Daniel stood there, not inside, not pushing forward, just waiting, his presence quieter this time, but no less certain. He forgot this, he said, holding up the small toy car Noah had dropped near the couch the night before. Emily stared at it for a second, her mind catching up to the simplicity of the gesture, the unexpected normalcy of it. You came back for that? She asked softly. Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. I came back because he matters, he said. The words were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried a weight that settled deeper than anything else he had said before. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the door, her defenses shifting again, not breaking, but no longer as solid as they had been. You do not get to decide that overnight, she replied quietly. Daniel nodded once, accepting the resistance without pushing against it. You are right, he said. Then he held out the small toy, his hand steady. But I can start by showing up. The simplicity of it left no space for argument, and for the first time since this began, Emily did not immediately know how to respond. Emily Carter did not take the toy right away, her eyes lingering on the small object in Daniel Hayes's hand as if it carried more weight than something so simple should, and for a moment, the space between them felt suspended in a quiet hesitation that neither of them moved to break. The hallway behind him was still, the faint hum of distant activity blending into the background, but inside the doorway, everything felt sharper, more defined, like each second mattered in a way it had not before. You should have just left it, Emily said softly, though her voice lacked the firmness it had carried the night before. Daniel did not lower his hand. He would notice, he replied calmly. And I did not want him to think something important had been lost. The words settled differently than she expected, not as a challenge, but as a quiet understanding of something she had never needed to explain. Emily reached out slowly then, her fingers brushing against his as she took the toy, the contact brief but enough to make her pull back slightly, as if even that small connection carried more meaning than she was ready to face. Thank you, she said, the words quiet, almost automatic. Daniel nodded once, but he did not step away. Not yet. How is he this morning? He asked, his tone softer now, less like a man asking for answers, more like someone trying to understand a life he had only just discovered. Emily hesitated, the question catching her off guard in its simplicity. He is fine, she replied after a second. He went to school. Daniel absorbed that, a small shift in his posture betraying a thought he did not voice immediately. Which school? He asked. Emily's gaze sharpened slightly, the boundary returning just enough to remind him that not everything would be given so easily. Why does that matter? She countered. Daniel did not push. He let the silence sit for a second, then answered with the same calm certainty he had carried from the beginning. Because if I am going to be part of this, I need to understand his world, he said. The statement was not forceful, but it was direct, and Emily felt it land in a place she had been carefully protecting. You are not part of this, she replied quickly, the words coming faster now, stronger, as if saying them could make them true again. Daniel watched her for a moment, not reacting to the resistance, but not stepping back from it either. You keep saying that, he said quietly. But you are the only one still trying to believe it. The truth in that stung more than she expected, and Emily looked away, her grip tightening slightly around the small toy in her hand. For 3 years she had controlled every detail, every decision, every outcome. But control required distance, and distance was something she no longer had. You cannot just walk into his life, she said, her voice steadier now, more measured. You do not know what that does to a child. Daniel's expression shifted again, not defensive, not dismissive, but thoughtful in a way that suggested he had already considered that. I know what it does when someone does not show up, he replied. The words were quiet, but they carried something deeper, something personal that Emily had not expected. She looked at him then, really looked, searching for the meaning behind what he had said, but he did not elaborate, did not explain. He simply stood there, letting the statement exist on its own. I am not trying to disrupt his life, Daniel continued after a moment. I am trying to understand where I fit in it. Emily let out a slow breath, her defenses shifting again, not breaking, but no longer as rigid as before. And if there is no place for you? She asked. Daniel did not hesitate. Then I will respect that, he said. But I will not accept it without knowing the truth. The honesty in that left little room for argument, and Emily felt the weight of it settle into the space between them. This was not a man looking to take something. This was a man trying to understand something he had not been given the chance to choose. You think showing up once makes you part of his life? She said quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, he replied. But it is how it starts. The simplicity of that made it harder to dismiss. Emily looked down at the toy in her hand, her fingers tracing the edges absent-mindedly, grounding herself in something small and real. He asked about you this morning, she said after a moment, her voice softer now, less guarded. Daniel's attention sharpened instantly, though his expression remained controlled. What did you tell him? He asked. Emily hesitated, then answered honestly. That I do not know what happens next. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that, not as uncertainty, but as an opening. That is fair, he said. The hallway remained quiet, the moment stretching just long enough for both of them to feel the shift that had taken place, subtle but undeniable. Emily stepped back slightly then, the door still open, but no longer just a barrier. You should go, she said again, but this time, it sounded less like a command and more like a pause. Daniel understood the difference. He inclined his head once, acknowledging it without pushing further. I will come back, he said, not as a question, but as a promise. Emily did not respond right away. She simply stood there, watching him as he turned and walked down the hallway, his steps steady, unhurried, as if he already knew this was not something that would be resolved in a single moment. When he disappeared from view, Emily closed the door slowly, the soft click echoing again through the apartment, but this time, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something she had spent years trying to avoid. And now, for the first time, she was no longer sure she wanted to. The rest of the day unfolded with a strange kind of quiet, the kind that did not come from peace but from anticipation, and Emily Carter felt it in every small movement she made, in the way she checked the clock more often than she needed to, in the way her thoughts kept circling back to the same place no matter how hard she tried to stay present. By late afternoon, the light in the apartment had softened into a warm glow that stretched across the floor, touching the edges of the couch where Noah's blanket still lay slightly folded, a quiet reminder of the night before that refused to fade into something ordinary. When the door finally opened again, it was not with hesitation this time, but with the familiar sound of small footsteps and the soft thud of a backpack hitting the floor. I am home, Noah called out, his voice brighter than it had been that morning, carrying the simple energy of a day that had continued forward without knowing what waited for it. Emily stepped out from the kitchen, forcing a smile that felt more natural than it had earlier, her focus shifting instantly to him. How was school? She asked, her tone gentle, steady, grounding. Noah shrugged lightly as he kicked off his shoes, his movements quick, unburdened. It was fine, he said, then paused, his eyes lifting to meet hers, with a question that had clearly stayed with him all day. Did he come back? The room seemed to still for just a second, the question landing exactly where she had known it would. Emily took a slow breath, crossing the space between them and kneeling slightly so she was at his level again. Yes, she said honestly. Noah's eyes widened just a little, not in fear, but in curiosity that had only grown stronger. And? He asked. Emily hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because she did not yet know how to shape it into something that would not change everything too quickly. And we talked, she said simply. Noah nodded, absorbing that, his mind already moving ahead. Is he coming again? He asked. Emily's gaze softened, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He said he would, she replied. Noah considered that for a moment, then gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if something inside him had settled into place, not fully understood, but accepted in a way that only children could manage. Okay, he said quietly, And just like that, he turned and moved toward the small table, pulling out a chair and beginning to unpack his bag, shifting back into the rhythm of his day as if the question had been enough for now. Emily watched him for a moment, a quiet realization settling over her that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer just hers to manage alone. Across the city, Daniel Hayes stood once more at the edge of something he had never planned for, but could no longer ignore. The sun had begun to dip below the skyline, casting long shadows through the wide windows of his office, and for the first time in years, the view did not feel like control. It felt like distance. He had spent the day reviewing numbers, making decisions, moving through meetings with the same precision that had built everything he had, but none of it had stayed with him. Not in the way this had. His phone rested on the desk in front of him, silent now, the legal briefs untouched since morning, the path they offered still there, still clear, but no longer the one he intended to take. He reached for the phone slowly, not to call a lawyer, not to issue a directive, but to do something simpler. Something he had not done before. Back in the apartment, Emily moved through the motions of the evening, preparing dinner, setting the table, listening to Noah talk about small details from his day, the kind of details that once felt like everything, and still did, but now carried a new layer beneath them. As she placed a glass of water in front of him, a soft vibration broke through the quiet. Her phone, resting on the counter, lighting up with a number she recognized instantly, even though it had never appeared there before. Her hand stilled for just a second, her eyes fixed on the screen as if the decision to answer or not could still hold something in place. Noah looked up, noticing the pause. "Mom?" he asked softly. Emily exhaled slowly, reaching for the phone with a steadiness she did not fully feel, her thumb hovering for just a moment before she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice calm, controlled. There was a brief silence on the other end, not empty, but deliberate. Then Daniel's voice came through, quieter than before, but clearer in a way that carried no hesitation. "I would like to see him again," he said. Emily closed her eyes for a second, not in resistance, but in recognition of something she could no longer deny. This was no longer about whether he would be part of their lives. It was about how. And when she opened her eyes again, looking across the room at Noah, who watched her with quiet attention, she understood that the answer she gave next would not just change her life. It would shape his. Emily Carter did not answer right away, the phone still pressed gently against her ear as the quiet of the apartment seemed to gather around her, every small sound fading into the background until all that remained was the weight of the moment, and the voice on the other end of the line waiting without pressure, without demand. Across the table, Noah watched her, his eyes steady, curious, not anxious, just aware that something important was unfolding in a way he could feel but not yet fully understand. Emily's gaze met his, and for a second, everything else fell away, the past, the fear, the careful walls she had built over the years, all of it narrowing down to one simple truth she could no longer ignore. He deserved more than silence. "Okay," she said softly into the phone, the word leaving her lips before she had time to reshape it, and once it was spoken, it did not feel like a loss of control. It felt like a choice. There was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, but acknowledgement, as if Daniel Hayes understood exactly what that one word meant. "Thank you," he replied quietly, and the simplicity of it caught her off guard. Not triumph. Not expectation. Just gratitude. Emily lowered the phone slowly, ending the call as the room settled into a different kind of quiet, one that no longer carried the same tension, but something steadier, something unknown but not entirely unwelcome. Noah tilted his head slightly, watching her with that same thoughtful expression that had become more frequent in the past 2 days. "He is coming back," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Emily nodded, stepping closer to the table, her hand resting lightly against the back of his chair. "Yes," she said gently. Noah looked down for a moment, then back up at her, his voice softer now. "Are you okay?" The question surprised her, not because of what it asked, but because of who was asking it. Emily smiled then, a real one this time, not forced, not careful, just honest in a way she had not allowed herself to be in a long time. "I think I am," she said. And for the first time, it felt true. The next afternoon arrived with a quiet kind of clarity, the kind that came not from certainty, but from acceptance, and when the knock came at the door, it did not startle Emily the way it had before. She walked toward it with steady steps, her hand resting on the handle for just a second before she opened it. Daniel stood there again, the same as before, composed, present, but this time, there was something different in the space between them. Not distance. Not tension. Something closer to understanding. "Hi," he said simply. Emily stepped aside, the gesture small but meaningful, an invitation that had not existed before. "Come in," she replied. Noah was already standing in the living room, his small frame straight, his eyes fixed on the doorway with quiet anticipation. When Daniel stepped inside, their gazes met again, but this time, it was not curiosity alone that filled the space. It was recognition. "Hi, Daniel," Noah said, his voice calm, certain. Daniel paused for just a second, then nodded, something softer settling into his expression. "Hi, Noah," he replied. There was no rush, no overwhelming moment, just a quiet exchange that carried more meaning than anything louder could have held. Emily watched them both, her heart steady in a way she had not expected, as if something inside her had finally aligned with what was happening instead of resisting it. "We can sit," she said gently, motioning toward the small couch. Daniel followed, taking a seat at a respectful distance, while Noah remained standing for a moment longer before sitting beside his mother, his hand finding hers instinctively. The three of them sat there, not as strangers, not as a complete family, but as something in between, something still forming, still uncertain, but real. "I brought something," Daniel said after a moment, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small book, simple, colorful, the kind meant for a child. He held it out carefully. "I thought we could read it together." Noah looked at it, then at Emily, silently asking a question he did not need to voice. Emily nodded once, her smile gentle but certain. "That sounds nice," she said. Noah took the book slowly, his fingers brushing against Daniel's as he did, the contact brief but enough to mark the moment. He opened it, glancing down at the pages before looking back up. "You can read," he said simply. Daniel nodded, shifting slightly as he began, his voice calm, steady, filling the small apartment with something new, something that had not been there before. Not tension. Not uncertainty. Something warmer. Emily leaned back slightly, her eyes moving between them, taking in the quiet scene, the sound of a story being read, the presence of a man who had once been a memory and was now something real. And as the words filled the room, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider until now. He had not come to take something from them. He had come to be part of it. And sometimes, the hardest part of protecting a life was learning when to let someone else step into it. Because love was not always about holding on. Sometimes, it was about making space.